Welcome back, folks, to episode 62 of the Running Man Self-Regulation Skill and Self-Improvement Project podcast with me, your host, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology, licensed professional counselor, and an adjunct professor at a local community college. And what I'd like to do today, I'd like to discuss a quote. And actually, it's a series of statements that I will largely be quoting as accurately as possible from Tim Ferriss. And it brought me to a point of thinking, allowed me to take pause, because what I'm doing with this podcast is reaching out and sharing how-tos and the whatnots of self-regulation skills, self-regulatory skills that are learned and things that we assume others should know whenever communication tends to go awry. But let me start with a quote. I think it's really pertinent to what the discussion is going to be, and then we'll move forward from there. So once again, this was from Tim Ferriss this morning. I was on Twitter at X, for those of you that would rather call it that. And Hecklefish says he'll never call it X. If you know what I'm talking about, follow the Y files. It's kind of cool. It's really entertaining. But here goes. The inner voice, the voice that no one will ever hear, but is the master storyteller, and the stories we tell ourselves are our reality. How well you revisit the tone and the content of your private voice is what determines the quality of your life. Now that is a lot to chew on, but the fact of the matter is it speaks very clearly to what it is that my goal is as far as this podcast and teaching self-regulatory skills, mental, emotional, and physical, as they all interconnect. And unlike Descartes' error, wherever we have the ghost in the machine, there is the ghost in the machine, and then there's the environment and how it impacts the machine, so to speak. But what I want to point out is that the very thing that is our inner voice, that part of ourselves that is just as much our inner observer as it is our inner voice that springs from that is the non-egoic, but the resultant outcome of what it is that is our conditioning, our experience, our rearing or parenting that we may have gotten growing up from whomever it was that was our parenting figure, or family with whom maybe we were reared and raised to become the people that we've become over time. Now, the important part of this is that there is always that silence and that quality of time that we isolate away from people, where we stealthily go away and find some quiet and distance where we can gather ourselves and we can be alone with our thoughts, so to speak, or sometimes just allow the silence to be within as it is without. And those are important things. But our voice, our inner voice, that part of us that is us, that is the unfiltered, truest part of our opinion that we have of our experience, and more importantly, of the quality of who we are and how we see ourselves, our judgment, our self-adjudication, that stems from that very internal voice that no one will ever hear. Now, just because we have something inside and bring it out and about such that we can share it and speak it to somebody does not mean that that is our inner voice. Those are our higher level social aspects that we rationalize and reason and also bring about to get along, so to speak, in the social scheme. But fundamentally, the inner voice, that me, that self-judgment of myself, that acceptance of myself, or lack thereof, that very self-acceptance maybe we all need, it's the part that we never speak to anyone. It's that part when somebody asks us sometimes, hey, are you doing okay? Are you having thoughts of not wanting to be here, wanting to hurt yourself? Things that I run into a lot in my profession. And also just being a peer or a friend. You may have somebody that will not say anything because they don't want to burden you. And within that, sometimes we hold things within. But at the same time, our social voice is one that we can share with somebody if we deem it safe. But our inner voice, it's a little different. It's a little different that's the part that is solely ours, and it's solely for ourselves. And it's not something that we share with anyone because it's part of our conscious observational of what's going on in this life. Doing the Super Mario Kart, having no first person player experience of me living my life, and the comments they might have, hey, you did good, oh, that was terrible, or you dirty bastard, you shouldn't have done that, having these adjudications, oh, you're great, this sort of thing that no one else will hear, but you will hear within, and may never ever be verbalized or spoken in an audible sense. But yet it's still our inner voice. This is the part that it's speaking to and is profound. Because there are parts of us that often, we have our social self. We have that person whom we think that we are. That's our self-image, or that self-image, the subjective idea of whom we think we are, that we're trying to proffer out into the world and assume that people take it the way we send it. Of course, they have their own interpretation, and rarely does that match what we think we are or whom we think we are. And that can be kind of uncomfortable, of course. But the point is, the inner voice is that part of us that will always steal away in silence and be within. And those are our deepest, most truest senses of self. Now, this sounds a little melancholy, and that wasn't the point of this, but rather recognizing that there is great power in that very inner voice as well, that has to do with what the quote said, revisiting that tone and the content of what our inner voice speaks to us. So I'm asking this question rhetorically, in that you should ask yourself, what do I tell myself when I get angry? What do I say to myself whenever I'm sad? What do I say to myself when I've succeeded at something? And what happens to that tone whenever I make a mistake? Is the first thing that comes out of my mouth at the social level, oh, you dummy, or you messed that up, or are you an idiot? And we question and become impatient, and our tone changes to abrupt and judging, and therefore less accepting, at least in sound. And we may be hard on ourselves. We know that we become our own harshest self-judgment. So once again, those questions to ask are, what do I say? How do I say what I'm saying? And do I become rude and judgmental of myself? This isn't a hard question to answer, mind you, because those things happen to us every day, many times a day, when we're acting or maybe not acting as we should, or succeeding or doing or executing what we call the details of our life. So this answer is not far from the surface, and that's why I ask it. But also, this is my encouragement. If this is about self-regulatory skill, part of the self-regulation isn't judging ourselves harshly and then becoming averse to hearing those things. And those things are adverse things, mind you, over time. And if our negative self-talk, if we want to call it that, is such that it's painful to hear, that we don't make mistakes or allow ourselves to do that, are we pushing ourselves to a false sense of perfectionism? One that becomes unhealthy, one that limits our ability to be creative because, I'm not going to make that mistake. Or maybe I won't take risks or try things that are new simply because of not fear of failure per se. That could be part of it, but more so fear of the judgment and the internal harassment that may occur. Maybe my internal voice is excessively harsh, and revisiting the tone and the content once again, I believe is very important, and I do believe has a lot to do with how well we can self-regulate. Externally, what our behaviors may be; internally, what our thoughts and our emotions should be whenever we're doing things that are of a nature that has a goal or an endpoint or an outcome we want to achieve. So very important to recognize that inner voice, that one voice that, not unlike the quote spoke, that is never heard by anyone else. It's not heard by no one. It is heard by someone, but that someone is me. That someone is the I. That someone is the individual. That self, that me, that was me before I knew that I had a name or a face. That me that could not recognize themselves in the mirror or any sort of reflection. So that very basic self that is us before we knew we were an us or I, a them or they or a we or a me for that matter. Before I can identify in any of those ways, that is that sense of observational awareness, that attention that never turns off, that's always on. It's those internal eyes and internal ears that don't have a shut-off switch from when we're in utero, when we're still learning at that point, to whenever we're born and start learning to move about in the world and are nurtured and cared for by our parents still old enough to care for ourselves for the most part. It's been there for all those experiences, and therefore it's recorded those things. And when we're learning, sometimes by modeling what our models did or how our models were, may have shaped us into becoming the internal monologue that we may have when we're trying to get ourselves to straighten up and look at ourselves in the mirror and make sure that we put on a good show and put on a good presentation, because we know it's about suggestion. The suggestion that we give not by words, but by presence and how we present ourselves. And also the suggestion that the environment is giving us and showing that we can't be a pushover, or that we are receptive or non-receptive, or maybe even aggressive for that matter. All of these things are forces that inner voice helps to shape, but also that our earlier shaping environment may have taught us to assume to be appropriate or correct. So there's much to think about within the idea of that inner voice that no one hears. But of course, we do know that we're the one person that hears that, the one individual, the one self. Now, how is this useful to self-regulatory skills? If we look at it from a more positive sense, if we are gentle with ourselves and able to say, okay, made a mistake there, what next? And not getting hung up on it. Developing a mind that's a little more fluid and a little less sticky, in the sense that we become less attached or less apt to attach to the outcomes, in a sense that it becomes personal and therefore a judgment of our value, of our character, or our merit as an individual. We no longer tie the event to the individual. Now, this does not mean that there's no repercussion or responsibility or accountability. It doesn't mean that at all. Not even in the same ballpark. So if you've gone there, come on back. This is where we're at instead. We're talking about the process of developing a fluid mind. Now, if you have followed along in the podcast long enough from the earlier episodes, I covered Miyamoto Musashi's book of 5 Rings on several occasions, and just some details on that. But the mind that he speaks of is what the Zen practitioners called no mind. And this also is a quality of mindfulness that is not one thing that tends to, in quotes, mind when things happen, but rather observes them and experiences them and engages them as needed, but also at the same time does not judge the individual involved as being successful, unsuccessful, bad, or good as a result. And we may have an excellent result, we may have a poor result, but it's neither the extreme good or bad. It's not a black and white absolute. We know that things are rather gray in a sense, that there are variations and gradations of excellence or shittiness for that matter, but we understand that it's not one or the other, but it can be a plethora of things all at once. So that being the case, that sense of fluid mind that we move towards is one of the things that we want to experience or have our life experience with. So that way we don't not only get too attached, but rather we attach as needed and enjoy the depth of those relationships and loves of little ones and family and friends and pets and nature, this sort of stuff. But at the same time, not becoming so attached that when we walk away that it's painful. And that's where we become codependent in an unhealthy sense. And we start losing a sense of control of who we are. And our center is no longer center, but more so a little left of center. And I'm not talking about voting left, but if y'all understand that, hopefully you're laughing with me and not at me. But if you do, that's okay too. I don't mind a little giggle or chortle at my expense. So the important part is, once again, that voice, the inner voice, the one that only we hear and that we listen to, and that no one else around this earth will ever be able to share it with us. All we can share are the experiences at the social level that we can opine about, that we can think about at the higher level and be able to speak about in that sense. But this is very personal, very, very secret, very, very individual, and it's very unique person to person. Now, this does not mean that sometimes we don't need motivation. It doesn't mean that we can't use what we have if we do have a negative or harsh self-judgment as part of that internal voice, especially if we've made mistakes that have been horrendous. Sometimes we need that. But allowing that to get into a way of self-respect or self-love and self-care, or even the ability to be able to forgive yourself as much as one would oneself, which is really easy away from us. The away froms are really easy as far as I love you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you. And that sort of thing is done with the Hawaiian Huna methodologies. But the important thing is knowing that whenever our inner voice prevents us from even accepting ourselves, that's where we start experiencing problems, and those stressors start to leak out in other areas. And we may be starting to seek, or in a sense that we might be in a way that could become codependent, could be maybe unhealthy in the sense that we interact or relate with people in a way that is about payoff versus just experiencing somebody and enjoying company. Whenever we're seeking company to get payoff, to get that sense of acceptance that we won't even allow ourselves to give to ourselves, because we either don't value ourselves or block ourselves from having that because we consider ourselves undeserving, because our levels of expectation are much too unrealistic and too high. But yet if someone else gives it to us, it's okay. And if we don't even allow ourselves to have that, then wow, that can become really uncomfortable, I would think. So just some thoughts on that inner voice, and also paying attention to what the tone is of that silent inner voice that no one ever hears except ourselves. And also be willing to question what the content and tone is of how it speaks to me. Because how it speaks to me certainly is a precursor to the suggestions we give ourselves in verbiage and in practice through our self-improvement efforts. And it can also be the very thing that sabotages what it is we're trying to do when we try to improve ourselves, when we try to better ourselves, when we try to become more and do more and experience excellence at whatever skills we're trying to develop. So one of the most compassionate things we can do for ourselves is be willing to be kind to yourself at the deepest level, at the level that is of the internal voice, that silent voice that no one else hears. And also regulating that content and tone in a more positive sense. If you catch yourself saying or feeling things that are overly judgmental or harassing, being willing to change. Now, this is the catcher. To do that, it's not going to happen the first time and all of a sudden it's going to be 100%. It's going to require repetition and practice. Just like whenever we look at motivational interviewing, they talk about readiness to change, and then finally at the very end, after the pre-contemplative structure, you get into contemplative, then into the action phase, and then finally into the maintenance where you've gained skill. I don't like to use the term mastery because I come more from the martial arts side, and true mastery never occurs in a lifetime, but varying degrees of excellence over time, moving towards that ideal and goal. Yes, I can see that. But in the more Western sense, gaining skill requires repetition and practice, just like we can practice and repeat a very negative behavior and get really good at it, but we wouldn't call it good because that would be oxymoronic almost, saying that I'm really good at doing drugs, I'm really good at getting drunk. It doesn't sound right. But yet whenever I'm getting really good at dribbling a basketball or getting really good at carrying a ball and running really fast, that sounds better because it sounds like we've developed a skill over time by virtue of, in quotes, practice. Well, any kind of repetition is a practice of sort. And in all things that we want to get better at, that we can do over and over time, we get better. We gain skill by repetition. By default, it's repetition and repetition only, that we will gain skill in certain things. And not unlike that, even mental skills, self-regulation skills require that we repeat, rinse, repeat, and then, finally clean. Assuming you have hair. I have none, so I'm assuming that shampoo stuff works pretty good. So that being the case, what I want to tell you is keep this in mind. Whenever we're working at our self-regulation skills, any one of them, in addition to this, paying attention to the content and tone, revisiting the content and the tone of our internal voice, you're going to have to do it more than a few times. But when you do, you will note a self-awareness. You will note a difference. And just as long as you have a goal, I want to treat myself better. I want to not say ugly things to myself. I want to say good things to myself. That's the most powerful suggestion that we have there that can help us be more apt to learn and gain skill, not only at that, speaking nicely to ourselves, but also becoming more skillful at those areas that otherwise, if we would have made a mistake or not succeeded very quickly, we might have judged ourselves or harassed ourselves out of the opportunity to gain skill because it felt so bad otherwise because of the internal harassment. So this is about gaining some skill and regaining some control of what goes on inside at the deepest level, at the self level, at the level where only we can hear that voice. Speak nicely to yourself. Now, that's going to be it for today. I want to tell you thank you for sharing some time with me. I certainly enjoyed this Saturday afternoon chat with you. And what I would like to tell you is that this podcast is available on all platforms: Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and also iTunes. iTunes has actually overtaken Spotify as far as the preferred medium of consumption of this podcast. I'm really enjoying seeing those numbers. But please do share this podcast with people that you think may benefit from it. And also, if you know somebody that would not benefit from it, give it to them anyway. Say I sent you, and that way you don't get any trouble. But I certainly have appreciated, once again, your reaching out and saying hello and listening and paying attention. So if you have any feedback for me, send it to the email at runningmangetskillsproject@gmail.com, and we'll talk to you soon. And on the next, take care, and until the next, walk well.